The day I discovered my husband was having an affair wasn't the day our marriage ended. It was the day I finally understood it had been over for years. I just hadn't been paying attention. Richard and I had spent 4 decades building a life together. 40 years of shared dinners, family holidays, and dreams we'd carefully constructed brick by brick. And in the end, it took 15 minutes in his office after hours to tear it all down. The image of his hands on her waist, her lipstick, on his collar, those details aren't what broke me. It was the tenderness in his eyes when he looked at her, a softness I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I simply closed the door quietly and drove home to our empty 5-bedroom house in Riverside's most prestigious neighborhood. A home I'd spent decades decorating, maintaining, and turning into the showplace. Everyone in town envied. I sat in our kitchen, surrounded by granite countertops and custom cabinetry, and realized I couldn't remember the last time Richard had kissed me like he meant it. Here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't just reveal who someone else truly is. It reveals who you've become in their shadow. And standing in that kitchen, I barely recognized myself anymore. My name is Helen Anderson, Nell to everyone who knows me. I met Richard during my sophomore year at Ohio State, back when his hair was thick and dark, and his ambitions were even bigger than his smile. I was studying finance, with dreams of working on Wall Street. He was in engineering, brilliant and charismatic in a way that made professors and students alike gravitate toward him. Our first date was at a tiny Italian restaurant just off campus. He spent 3 hours telling me about his plans to revolutionize structural engineering, to build a firm that would change skylines across the Midwest. I remember being mesmerized by his passion, by the way his hands moved when he talked about load-bearing calculations and sustainable materials. When he asked about my dreams, I told him about my finance aspirations, how I wanted to help businesses grow while making smart investments of my own. "That's cute," he said, patting my hand. "You'd make a great accountant for my company someday." I should have seen it then, that subtle dismissal of my ambitions. But it was 1982, and I was raised to believe that being the power behind the throne was the highest achievement a woman could hope for. So I laughed and squeezed his hand and told myself that supporting a great man was its own kind of greatness. We married a year after graduation. I abandoned my master's program to help him start Mitchell Engineering from our tiny apartment in Riverside. While Richard networked and wooed clients, I managed our precarious finances, stretching every dollar until it screamed. I typed his proposals late into the night, organized his filing system, answered his phones, and scheduled his meetings. When we couldn't afford a receptionist, I became one. When we couldn't pay for an accountant, I taught myself business accounting. Our first big contract came 3 years in, a municipal building in downtown Riverside. The night Richard landed it, he twirled me around our little kitchen and said, "We did it, Nellie." That "we" felt like vindication, like partnership, like my sacrifices had been worthwhile. Daniel came along 2 years later, followed by Jennifer 18 months after that. The business was growing but still fragile. We couldn't afford full-time childcare, so I brought the children to the office, setting up a playpen next to my desk while I managed the company books, scheduled Richard's meetings, and soothed nervous clients. "Just until we're stable," Richard would say. "Then you can focus on the kids, or go back to school if you want." That stability always seemed just around the corner, perpetually 6 months away. The firm expanded. Richard brought on Gerald Thompson as a partner. We moved to a bigger office, hired staff. But there was always a reason I needed to stay involved: a new project, a demanding client, a financial hiccup that required my steady hand. The years blurred together. School drop-offs and client meetings, soccer games and business. Dinners. I maintained our social calendar, hosted parties for Richard's clients, joined the right clubs, and sat on the right charity boards. I was the consummate corporate wife, the secret weapon Richard deployed when a client seemed hesitant or a competitor got too close. When we finally moved into the large colonial on Maple Avenue in Oakwood, Richard proudly gave guests tours, describing how he'd worked his way up from nothing. Sometimes he'd put his arm around me and add, "Of course, Nell kept the home fires burning," as if my contribution had been making pot roast while he built an empire single-handedly. I remember standing in our new kitchen after one such dinner party, washing crystal glasses worth more than my father's monthly salary when I was growing up, and wondering when exactly I had transitioned from partner to prop. The children grew, up and moved out. Daniel went to medical school, eventually opening a practice in Cincinnati. Jennifer became an attorney, married Thomas, and settled in Columbus. They gave us grandchildren who Richard adored in theory, but rarely made time to. See? Our house grew quieter. The spaces between conversations stretched longer. Richard turned 60, and the firm was thriving beyond our wildest dreams. Mitchell and Thompson engineering consultants had projects in 6 states. We had more money than we could spend in 2 lifetimes. Richard's schedule was still packed with meetings and site visits, industry conferences, and client dinners. "When will you slow down?" I asked on his birthday, watching him check emails during our supposedly special dinner. "Soon," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Just a few more big projects I want to land. Then we'll travel, see the world, make up for lost time." I believed him because I needed to, because admitting that soon would never come was too painful to contemplate. 3 months later, he hired Vanessa Cooper as his executive assistant. She was 34, with a business degree and subtle highlights in her dark hair. She laughed at Richard's jokes and brought him coffee exactly how he liked it. 1 sugar, splash of cream. She sent me flowers on my birthday with a note that read, "Richard speaks so highly of you." Richard started coming home later. There were more business trips, more weekend emergencies at the office. He bought new cologne and started getting regular haircuts instead of waiting until I reminded him his hair was getting too long over his ears. I knew what was happening. I just couldn't bring myself to confirm it. After 40 years, confronting the death of your marriage feels impossible, like trying to move a mountain with your bare hands. So I pretended not to notice when he started, locking his phone. I feigned sleep when he slipped into bed at midnight, smelling of unfamiliar perfume. I told myself it was a phase, a last grasp at youth before he settled into retirement. Then came that Tuesday evening in April. I'd made Richard's favorite meal, beef Wellington with roasted potatoes and haricots verts. He called to say he'd be working late, again. Something about a proposal deadline. I sat at our dining room, table alone, staring at the 2-place settings, the candles I'd lit, the bottle of wine breathing in its crystal decanter. 40 years, 4 decades of putting his dreams before mine, of being the perfect wife, the steadfast supporter, the woman behind the great man, and he couldn't even bother to call until after I'd cooked dinner. I drove to his office without really deciding to. The parking lot was nearly empty, just Richard's Mercedes and a sporty red Audi I recognized as Vanessa's. The security guard waved me in with a smile. "Working late again, Mrs. Mitchell. You're as dedicated as your husband." I thanked him and took the elevator to the executive floor. The hallway was quiet, the overhead lights dimmed for the evening. I heard them before. I saw them. Low laughter coming from Richard's corner office. The door was ajar, spilling a wedge of light across the carpeted corridor. I should have made noise. Cleared my throat. Given some warning. But 40 years of self-effacement had made me instinctively quiet, habitually considerate of Richard's space. So I saw it all in one uninterrupted tableau. Richard seated at his desk, his tie loosened. Vanessa perched on the edge, her skirt riding up her thighs. his hand on her leg, her fingers in his silver hair. They were looking at something on his computer screen, shoulders touching, heads bent together in perfect intimacy. "We could go to the Caymans," she was saying. "After everything's settled, that little resort you showed me." Richard kissed her wrist. "I'll have to handle Nell carefully." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "She's put up with a lot over the years." "She'll be fine," Vanessa said, her voice dismissive. "Women like that always land on their feet. They're survivors. Still, 40 years is a long time to untangle. And she knows nothing about our finances. I've handled everything." They both laughed at that, a private joke at my expense. And in that moment, something inside me, something that had been bending for decades, finally broke clean. I didn't confront them, didn't demand explanations or apologies. I simply walked back to my car, my heels silent on the plush carpet. I drove home with mechanical precision, following traffic laws to the letter. Inside our house, the house I had selected, decorated, and maintained while Richard built his precious firm, I went straight to his office and opened his filing cabinet. Richard believed I knew nothing about our finances because that's what he needed to believe. It made him feel powerful, indispensable. The truth was far different. I hadn't spent 40 years as the wife of an ambitious man without learning how to protect myself. I hadn't managed the early books of his company without understanding exactly how business empires are built and how quickly they can crumble. I spent that night going through documents, making calls to financial institutions where we held accounts, and sending emails to attorneys whose cards I'd collected over the years. By morning, I had a clear picture of our assets, liabilities, and vulnerabilities. I also had the beginnings of a plan. The next day I called Dorothy Simmons, Dot to her friends. We'd been close since our children attended the same preschool 3 decades earlier. Unlike me, Dot had divorced her husband Ted after catching him with a bartender 15 years ago. She'd rebuilt her life, started a successful interior design business, and now lived in a beautiful condo overlooking the river. "Come over," she said when I told her what I'd discovered. "Bring documents. And for God's sake, don't confront Richard until we've talked." Dot's living room was flooded with morning light when I arrived. She took one look at my face and poured coffee spiked with Irish whiskey. "Tell me everything," she said. "And I mean everything, Nell. No protecting him, no minimizing." So I did. I told her about the gradual distancing, the late nights, the business trips, the way Richard had systematically excluded me from decision-making while ensuring I remained useful to his social and professional advancement. How he'd discouraged me from finishing my degree or pursuing my own career, always with reasonable-sounding excuses about timing or practicality. And now he's planning to leave me for his 34-year-old assistant, I finished, my voice flat. After 40 years of marriage, after I gave up everything to help him succeed. Dot's eyes were hard. Men like Richard and Ted don't believe we built anything. They think they succeeded despite us, not because of us. They see us as expenses on their balance sheets, not assets. She reached for my hand. "But here's what they always forget, Nell. We know where the bodies are buried. We know which clients only stayed because of our charm at dinner parties. We know which partnerships succeeded because we smoothed ruffled feathers behind the scenes. We know which investments paid off because of our intuition, not their spreadsheets." She squeezed my fingers. "Richard thinks you know nothing about your finances? Use that. Let him underestimate you. It's the last mistake he'll ever make in your marriage." That afternoon, I visited Martin Hayes, a family law attorney recommended by a woman in my garden club who'd gone through a similar situation. His office was understated but elegant, with degrees from prestigious universities displayed discreetly on one wall. "Ohio is an equitable distribution state, Mrs. Anderson," he explained after hearing my situation. That means marital assets are divided fairly, but not necessarily equally. Courts consider factors like length of marriage, contributions of each spouse, including non-financial contributions, and economic circumstances going forward. What about his business? I asked. Mitchell and Thompson is worth millions now, but I was there when it was nothing. I worked without salary for years. Martin nodded. That's relevant. Very relevant. Do you have documentation of your involvement? Emails, letters, old business cards? Anything showing you had an active role rather than being a passive supporter? I smiled for the first time in days. Mr. Hayes, I have 40 years of documentation. I never throw anything away. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, Martin had outlined a strategy that made me feel something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Don't let him know you're preparing, Martin cautioned as I was leaving. The element of surprise is crucial. Men like your husband believe they're always the smartest person in the room. Let him keep believing that. I returned home and went about my normal routine. I prepared Richard's favorite dinner. I laid out his clothes for the next day. When he came home, earlier than usual, his expression carefully neutral, I greeted him with the same smile I'd worn for decades. How was your day, dear? I asked, pouring him his customary scotch. Busy, he said, watching me carefully. The Henderson project is taking more time than expected. I nodded sympathetically, noting the lie. The Henderson project had been completed weeks ago. I'd attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony and made small talk with the mayor while Richard received accolades. You work too hard, I said, touching his shoulder lightly. Maybe we should plan that vacation you've been promising. The Cayman Islands, perhaps. I hear they're lovely this time of year. His hand froze around his glass, but his face revealed nothing. Maybe in a few months, he said. Things are too hectic right now. For 2 weeks, I maintained the charade. I was the perfect wife, attentive, supportive, unquestioning. Meanwhile, I methodically gathered documents, transferred funds to accounts, in my name only, and prepared for the confrontation I knew was coming. Richard grew bolder, less careful about hiding his affair. Late nights became overnight trips. The scent of Vanessa's perfume clung to his suits when they came back from the dry cleaner. Twice I answered calls on our home phone only to hear breathing, and then a click as she hung up. Through it all, I smiled. I nodded. I pretended not to notice when he whispered into his cell phone in our backyard, thinking I couldn't see him through the kitchen window. I ignored the credit card charges from jewelry stores and upscale restaurants I'd never visited. While I was preparing for war. A war Richard didn't even know was coming. The moment everything changed wasn't when I discovered Richard's affair. It was 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when he finally decided to tell me about it. I was arranging peonies in the crystal vase his mother had given us for our 10th anniversary when he walked into the kitchen with that particular expression I'd come to recognize over 4 decades, the look he wore when he was about to deliver news he considered important. Shoulders back, chin slightly raised, eyes direct but not quite connecting with mine. Nell, we need to talk, he said, his voice measured in that way successful men practice, authoritative but not harsh. The voice he used with junior engineers when rejecting their proposals. I trimmed a stem and positioned it carefully among the pink blooms. About what, Richard? He sat at the island counter, folding his hands together like he was about to begin a business meeting. I think we both know things haven't been right between us for some time. Haven't they? I kept arranging flowers, my movements precise and unhurried. Richard cleared his throat. I've given this a lot of thought. We've had a good run, Nell. 40 years is nothing to sneeze at. We raised good kids, built a good life. But, I prompted, still not looking at him. But people change, grow apart, want different things as they get older. He paused, waiting for a reaction. When none came, he continued with slight irritation. I've been unfair to you, staying in a marriage that's become perfunctory. We both deserve more than that. I finally turned to face him, wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. And you found more with Vanessa. His eyes widened slightly, the only indication that I'd surprised him. He recovered quickly. Yes, I have. I didn't plan it, Nell. These things just happen. These things just happen, I repeated, like natural disasters, completely beyond human control. He frowned. I'm trying to be honest with you. After how many months of lying? His jaw tightened. That's not fair. I was trying to figure things out. I didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily. I folded the towel and placed it precisely on the counter. How considerate. Look, I know you're upset. That's understandable. But I'm hoping we can handle this like adults. No drama, no fighting, a clean break. I tilted my head. And what exactly does a clean break look like after 40 years, Richard? He relaxed slightly, moving into familiar territory, explaining how things would be, expecting me to nod and accept. I've spoken with my attorney. He's drawing up a fair settlement. You'll keep this house, of course. I'll provide generous support, enough that you'll never have to worry about money. How much is generous exactly? He named a figure that might have impressed anyone who didn't know our actual net worth. It was less than 5% of our assets. I see, I said quietly. And the business? Richard smiled indulgently. Nell, you know the business isn't part of this discussion. That's separate from our marital assets. Even though I worked there for years without salary, even though I managed the books, hired the first employees, secured the Henderson contract that put the company on the map, his expression hardened. That was 40 years ago. You've been a housewife for decades now. My company has grown because of my expertise, my relationships, my reputation in the industry. Your company, I repeated, not our company. Don't make this difficult, Nell. I've always taken care of you, and I'll continue to do so. But Mitchell & Thompson is non-negotiable. I noticed he was already referring to our marriage in the past tense. Had already decided everything without my input, just as he'd been doing for years. When are you planning to leave? I asked, my voice steady. I found a place downtown. I'll move some things this weekend. He hesitated. Vanessa and I are thinking of building something in Cedar Heights eventually. But there's no rush on that. Cedar Heights, the exclusive gated community where homes started at $2 million. Where we had once talked about building our forever home, before Richard decided the Colonial in Oakwood made more sense for entertaining clients. I see. I turned back to my flowers. Is there anything else? He seemed thrown by my calm. No. I suppose not. My lawyer will contact you with the paperwork. He stood hesitating. I am sorry, Nell. For what it's worth. 40 years, I said softly, not looking at him. And that's all you have to say? He sighed heavily. What else is there? We had a good run. Now it's over. Life goes on. After he left, I finished arranging the peonies, placing the vase on the dining room table where it caught the afternoon light beautifully. Then I walked calmly to my car and drove to Martin Hayes' office without calling ahead. His receptionist started to say he was in meetings all afternoon, but something in my expression made her pick up the phone. 2 minutes later, I was seated. In Martin's office, my hands folded in my lap to stop their trembling. He finally told me, I said. He's moving out this weekend. Already has his lawyer drawing up settlement papers. Martin nodded. Good. That means he's confident. Overconfident, based on what you've told me. Did he mention figures? I repeated. What Richard had offered. Martin actually laughed. Mrs. Anderson, that's insulting even as an opening position. But let him think you're considering it. The more he believes you're going to roll over, the better position we'll be in. He says the business is non-negotiable, that it's separate from our marital assets. Martin leaned forward. Mrs. Anderson, Nell, if even half of what you've told me is true, your husband is in for a very unpleasant surprise. Ohio courts consider many factors in determining what's marital property, including non-monetary contributions to a family. Business. Your work during those early years? Absolutely relevant. The fact that you managed the household entirely, allowing him to focus on growing the business? Also relevant. The social connections you cultivated that brought in clients? Very relevant. He opened a folder on his desk. Now, let's discuss the documentation you've provided so far and what else we need before we respond to his attorney's proposal. We spent 2 hours reviewing financial records, old business documents, and photographs I'd collected showing my involvement in company functions. As I was leaving, Martin put a hand on my shoulder. Nell, I know this is painful. 4 decades is a long time to invest in a relationship only to have it end this way. But I want you to know, based on what I've seen so far, you're in a much stronger position than your husband realizes. Just keep playing along a little longer. I nodded and headed home, stopping at Willow Creek Apartments on the way. I'd secretly toured a unit there 2 weeks earlier, a modern 2-bedroom with a balcony overlooking the river. I signed the lease right then, paying 6 months in advance from one of the accounts I'd opened in my name only. Richard would get his wish to move out this weekend, but he wouldn't be the only one leaving the house in Oakwood. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of the expensive Cabernet Richard imported by the case, the one he said was too fine for my undiscerning palate, and called Dot. He finally told me, I said when she answered. Gave me his practiced speech about growing apart and deserving more. Offered me the house and a generous stipend, like I'm a retired housekeeper. Dot snorted. Let me guess. He also explained that his business isn't up for discussion? Word for word. Men like Richard are so predictable, it would be funny if it weren't so infuriating, she said. So what's your next move? I signed the lease at Willow Creek today. I'm moving out this weekend. Same time he is. Let him come back to an empty house when he inevitably forgets something. Dot laughed. Perfect. What about the other matters we discussed? By other matters, she meant the financial contingencies we'd been putting in place. The previous week, we'd visited First National Bank of Riverside, where I'd maintained a safe deposit box in my name only for 20 years. Richard had no idea. It existed. Inside were copies of crucial documents, jewelry I'd inherited from my grandmother, and emergency cash. Martin is handling the legal side, I said. As for the rest, everything's proceeding as planned. Richard has no idea I've documented every contribution I made to building his precious firm. Good. Remember what I told you. Men like Richard only understand one language, consequences. Hit him where it hurts. After we hung up, I wandered through the house that had been my home for over 20 years. The dining room where I'd hosted countless dinner parties to impress Richard's clients. The living room where our children had opened Christmas presents and later announced engagements and pregnancies. The kitchen I'd remodeled 3 times to keep up with Richard's evolving vision of executive living. None of it felt like mine anymore. It was a stage set where I'd performed the role of the perfect corporate wife for decades. The thought of living there alone, surrounded by memories of a marriage that had apparently meant more to me than to my husband, was suffocating. I pulled out my phone and called Daniel, our son. He answered on the 3rd ring, the sounds of a busy medical practice in the background. Mom? Everything okay? I'm between patients. Your father and I are getting divorced, I said, seeing no point in sugarcoating it. He's been having an affair with his assistant. He's moving out this weekend. Silence, then. Jesus, Mom, are you serious? Dad and Vanessa? So he knew her. Name. Interesting. You knew? Daniel sighed heavily. I suspected. He brought her to Cincinnati last month for that engineering conference. I ran into them at a restaurant. He introduced her as his executive assistant, but the way they were together. I hoped I was misreading things. Why didn't you say anything? I tried to keep the hurt from my voice. What was I supposed to say? Hey, Mom, I think Dad's sleeping with his much younger assistant. I didn't know for sure, and honestly, I didn't want to. I understood that. No one wants to be the bearer of such news, especially to their own mother. Well, now you know for sure. He told me today. He's already got his lawyer drawing up papers. Are you okay? Do you need me to come home? No, honey. I'm handling it. Just wanted you to hear it from me before your father calls with his version of events. His version? What's that supposed to mean? I imagine he'll explain how we grew apart and how his relationship with Vanessa just happened. But he'll assure you he's taking care of me financially so you don't need to worry. Daniel was quiet for a moment. And that's not true? The growing apart part? Maybe. That happens when one person stops seeing the other as a partner and starts seeing them as an employee. The taking care of me part? He's offering me crumbs and expecting me to be grateful. Mom. Daniel hesitated. You never talk like this. You've always defended Dad, even when he was being a jerk. I was surprised by the emotion that surged through me. Maybe that was my first mistake, convincing everyone, including myself, that your father's selfishness was actually ambition, that his neglect was just the price of success. What are you going to do? What I should have done years ago. Stand up for myself. After we hung up, I called Jennifer. Her reaction was less surprised than her brother's. Finally, she said after I broke the news. I've been waiting for you to leave him for at least a decade. Jennifer, you never said anything. What was I going to say? Mom, your marriage is a textbook example of emotional inequality. You always seemed determined to make it work, no matter what. I didn't realize it was so obvious to everyone but me, I said quietly. Not obvious exactly. Just, Dad's always been Dad, you know, the center of his own universe. And you've always been the one adapting to his gravity, never the other way around. Tom and I have talked about it for years. The thought of my daughter and son-in-law discussing my failing marriage was mortifying. I'm sorry it affected you. Kids. Don't apologize, Jennifer said firmly. We're adults. We've made our own choices about the kind of relationships we want. I just wish. What? I wish you'd valued yourself as much as you valued him, as much as we value you. Her words stayed with me as I began quietly packing that evening. Not everything, just personal items Richard would never notice were missing. My grandmother's recipes, photo albums from before our marriage, the watercolors I'd painted in college, when I still believed I might have a life beyond being Richard's wife. On Saturday morning, Richard packed 2 suitcases and his golf clubs, claiming he'd return for the rest of his things once he was settled. He didn't ask why I was dressed in slacks and a blouse rather than my usual weekend attire of gardening clothes. Didn't notice the car keys in my hand or the small suitcase by the front door. I'll call you, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. We can discuss the settlement papers once you've had time to review them. Of course, I replied. Take all the time you need. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I called the moving company I'd hired. Within an hour, they arrived and began loading the items I'd designated. My personal belongings, family heirlooms that had come from my side, artwork I'd collected over the years. I'd made a precise inventory, including photographs of each item with notes about its provenance. I left behind anything Richard had given me, anything that had been purchased with joint funds for the house, and anything that might be contested later. I wasn't interested in fighting over material possessions. My battle would be focused elsewhere. By mid-afternoon, the movers had delivered everything to my new apartment at Willow Creek. It was smaller than the Oakwood house, but the afternoon sunlight streaming through the wide windows made it feel open and bright. For the first time in years, I was surrounded only by things I had chosen, things that held meaning for me. I unpacked slowly, arranging my grandmother's china in the kitchen cabinets, placing family photos on the built-in bookshelves, spreading my favorite quilt over the bed. With each item I positioned, I felt a small piece of myself returning, pieces I hadn't even realized I'd surrendered during my marriage. That evening, sitting on my new balcony watching the river flow past, I received a text from Richard. Forgot. My cufflinks. Stopping by house tomorrow a.m. to get them. I didn't respond. Let him discover my absence on his own. The next morning at 10, my phone rang. Richard's name flashed on the screen. "Where are you?" he demanded without preamble. "And where is all your stuff?" "Good morning to you too, Richard," I said calmly. "I've moved out. I thought it would be easier for both of us to make a clean break, as you put it." "Moved out? To where? Why didn't you tell me you were planning this?" "I found a lovely apartment at Willow Creek. As for not telling you, well, you didn't seem particularly interested in my plans when you informed me you were leaving." He made an exasperated sound. "That's different. I told you the house was yours. There was no need for you to move." "The house was never really mine, Richard. It was a showcase for your success. I want something that's mine, chosen by me, for me." "This is ridiculous. You're acting impulsively out of spite." "No, I'm acting deliberately out of self-respect. There's a difference." "Fine. Do what you want. But we still need to discuss the settlement. My lawyer sent the papers to your email yesterday." "Yes, I received them. My lawyer will be responding this week." There was a beat of silence. "Your lawyer? You hired a lawyer?" "Of course. Isn't that what people do when they're getting divorced after a 40-year marriage? Hire legal representation?" "Nell, that's unnecessary. My offer is more than fair. You don't need some shark trying to squeeze more money out of me." "Richard, after 40 years together, I think I've earned the right to determine what's fair. For myself." His voice hardened. "Don't make this ugly, Nell. You won't like the outcome." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check. You've been a housewife for decades. You have no idea what you're up against if you try to play hardball." I laughed softly. "That's where you're wrong, Richard. I know exactly what I'm up against. The question is, do you?" I ended the call and blocked his number. If he needed to reach me, he could do it through Martin. The next day, I visited First National Bank of Riverside. Robert Henderson, the manager, greeted me warmly. I'd known Bob for 20 years. We'd served on the community center fundraising committee together, and his wife was in my book club. "What can I do for you today, Mrs. Anderson?" he asked, ushering me into his office. "I need to make some changes to my accounts," I said, smiling pleasantly. "As you may have heard, Richard and I are separating." Bob's expression turned sympathetic. "I had heard rumors. I'm very sorry." "Thank you. I've decided it's time to reorganize my financial affairs in light of this change." I handed him a folder of documents. "I'd like to remove Richard's name from these accounts and transfer the funds to my new accounts." Bob reviewed the papers carefully. "These are all accounts you opened independently, with funds that were either inherited or gifted specifically to you. That simplifies things considerably." He looked up. "What about your joint accounts?" "I'm not touching those. Richard can have them. I'm only interested in what's legally and unquestionably mine." Bob nodded approvingly. "A sensible approach. Many people try to clean out everything in the heat of emotion, which only causes legal headaches later." He processed the paperwork efficiently, and within an hour, I had secured approximately $1. $2 million in assets that Richard couldn't touch, money I'd inherited from my parents and grandparents over the years, and carefully kept separate from our joint finances. It wasn't enough to live luxuriously for the rest of my life, but it was enough to ensure I wouldn't be financially desperate while the divorce proceedings unfolded. More importantly, it was mine, earned not through my connection to Richard, but through my own birthright. As I was leaving the bank, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was Jerry Thompson, Richard's business partner. "Nell," he said, his voice overly hearty. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Jerry. What can I do for you?" "I heard about you and Richard. Terrible shame after all these years. But these things happen, I suppose." "Yes. Extramarital affairs do seem to happen with remarkable frequency in certain circles. Did you need something specific, Jerry?" "I'm rather busy today." He cleared his throat. "Right. Well, Richard mentioned you might be feeling uncertain about the future, financial security and all that. I wanted to assure you that the firm values your contributions over the years. The annual holiday party won't be the same without your touch." I nearly laughed out loud at his patronizing tone. "How kind of you to worry about the holiday party during my divorce." "That's not what He sighed. "Look, Nell, I'm trying to be a friend here. Richard is concerned you might be getting some unhelpful legal advice, thinking you have claims on the business that won't stand up in court. I'd hate to see you waste money on legal fees chasing something that isn't viable." "And Richard sent you to warn me off? How thoughtful." "He's offering a very generous settlement, Nell. More than fair, considering. My advice as a friend, take it. Don't drag this out." "Your advice as a friend," I repeated slowly. "Tell me, Jerry, do you remember the Harris Project? 2002, I believe." There was a pause. "The municipal complex? What about it?" "Do you remember who secured that contract?" Well, Richard, obviously. He was lead on all municipal projects back then." "Actually, no. I secured that contract. Steve Harris's wife, Meredith, was on the hospital board with me. She arranged the introduction. I took Steve to lunch while Richard was in Cleveland. I got us in the door. Richard closed the deal, certainly, but he wouldn't have had the opportunity without me." "That was a long time ago, Nell." 23 years. And in those 23 years, how many contracts came through my social connections? How many client relationships were maintained because I remembered birthdays, sent personalized gifts, hosted dinners where everyone felt special and valued? Jerry was silent. "You seem to think I was just planning parties and picking out centerpieces, Jerry. But I was building and maintaining the relationships that kept your clients loyal. Do you think Richard ever sent a single thank you note without me writing it? Do you think he remembered a single client's wife's medical procedure or child's graduation without me reminding him?" "Nell, here's what's going to happen, Jerry. You're going to go back to Richard and tell him that his attempt to use you as an intermediary has failed spectacularly. And then you're going to suggest that he start taking my legitimate claims seriously before this gets even more expensive. For both of you." I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my purse, smiling slightly. Richard's predictable tactics were confirmation that I was on the right track. He wouldn't have sent Jerry if he wasn't worried. That evening, I received a call from Martin Hayes. "Mrs. Anderson, I've received a response from your husband's attorney. It seems Mr. Anderson is suddenly interested in mediation rather than proceeding with his original settlement offer." "Is he now? What changed his mind?" "Apparently our initial response outlining your contributions to Mitchell and Thompson gave him pause. His attorney is suggesting a meeting to discuss a more equitable distribution that recognizes Mrs. Anderson's historical role in the company's success." I smiled to myself. "And what do you recommend, Martin?" "I recommend we meet, hear what they have to offer, and then proceed with our original plan regardless. This feels like an attempt to gauge how serious you are, not a genuine offer. To be fair." "I agree. Schedule the meeting for next week. Let's see what Richard considers equitable now that he's realized I'm not going to disappear quietly." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the river in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time since Richard had confessed his affair, I felt a sense of calm purpose. The initial shock and pain were still there, but they'd been joined by something else, a growing recognition of my own strength. 40 years I'd spent building Richard's empire, managing his life, and smoothing his path. 40 years living in his shadow, convincing myself that his success was our success. Now I would use everything I'd learned during those years to ensure that the second half of my life belonged to me alone. Let Richard and Vanessa have their fantasy of starting fresh. I was reclaiming what had been mine all along, my dignity, my independence, and my fair share of everything we'd built together. The mediation meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at the offices of Greenfield & Associates, a neutral venue downtown. I spent the previous evening selecting my outfit carefully. Not the soft, feminine clothes Richard was accustomed to seeing me in, but a charcoal gray suit I'd purchased specifically for this meeting. Sharp lines, impeccable tailoring, and a subtle power that came from its simplicity. I paired it with pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and low heels that wouldn't leave me towering over anyone, but wouldn't require me to look up either. Appearance matters in negotiations. That was something Richard himself had taught me decades ago. People respond to visual cues of authority, he'd explained while choosing between nearly identical navy suits for an important client meeting. You need to look the part before they'll listen to what you have to say. Dot picked me up at 9, insisting on driving me to the meeting. You need a friendly face before and after, she said. Besides, I want a full report on Richard's expression when he realizes you're not rolling over. As we pulled up to the sleek glass building housing Greenfield & Associates, she squeezed my hand. Remember what we talked about. You were never just his wife. You were his secret weapon. Now you're your own secret weapon. Martin was waiting in the lobby, his briefcase and expression equally serious. Mrs. Anderson, you look well. Thank you, Martin. I feel well. Prepared. He nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right mindset. Mr. Anderson and his attorney are already upstairs. The mediator will join us shortly. The conference room was elegant in that intentionally intimidating way of high-end law firms. Walnut table gleaming under recessed lighting. Leather chairs that cost more than some people's monthly mortgage payments. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of the river and downtown Riverside. Richard was seated at the far end, his back to the door, deep in conversation with a silver-haired man I recognized as Walter Price, one of the most expensive divorce attorneys in the state. Neither noticed our entrance until Martin cleared his throat. Richard turned, his expression shifting rapidly from annoyed at the interruption to shocked at my appearance. I wasn't supposed to look like this. Poised, professional, powerful. I was supposed to arrive teary-eyed and uncertain, grateful, for any crumbs he deigned to offer. Nell, he said, recovering quickly, you look different. Hello, Richard. I took a seat across from him, placing my leather portfolio squarely before me. Martin sat beside me, methodically arranging his materials. Walter Price offered his hand across the table. Mrs. Anderson, I'm Walter Price, representing your husband. I hope we can make this process as painless as possible for everyone. I shook his hand firmly. Mr. Price, I've heard a great deal about you. Your reputation precedes you. All good things, I hope, he said with a practiced smile. Professional things, I replied, which is all that matters in this context. The mediator arrived then, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Patricia Winters. She introduced herself and explained the process, emphasizing that mediation was voluntary and non-binding, but could save both time and money if everyone approached it in good faith. So, she said after preliminaries were completed, I understand Mr. Anderson has put forward an initial settlement proposal, which Mrs. Anderson has declined. Perhaps we could begin by exploring why that proposal was unsatisfactory. Martin opened a folder. My client rejects the proposal on multiple grounds. First, it grossly undervalues her contributions to the marriage and to Mitchell and Thompson engineering consultants. Second, it misconceptualizes the company as separate property rather than marital assets. Third, it fails to account for Mrs. Anderson's non-monetary contributions that enabled the company's growth and success. Walter Price raised a manicured hand. With all due respect, the characterization of the business as marital property is fundamentally flawed. Mitchell and Thompson is a separate legal entity, and while Mrs. Anderson may have provided some administrative assistance in the company's early days, she has had no formal role in the company for decades. Some administrative assistance? I repeated softly. All eyes turned to me. Is that what you call managing the company books for the first 8 years, Mr. Price? Or securing the Harris municipal contract that kept the company afloat during the recession of 2001? Or personally calling every client when the Collins Bridge collapse threatened to destroy Mitchell and Thompson's reputation in 2007? Richard shifted uncomfortably. Nell, you're exaggerating your role. Yes, you helped out in the early days. I didn't help out, Richard. I built that company alongside you. Without salary, without recognition, without equity. But make no mistake, Mitchell and Thompson exists because of my labor as much as yours. Walter Price smiled condescendingly. Mrs. Anderson, while your perspective is understandable, the legal reality is that contributions of a spouse in a supportive role don't translate to ownership stakes in a business unless formally documented. There's no paperwork showing you, as an owner, officer, or even employee of Mitchell and Thompson. Martin slid a document across the table. Actually, there is. This is a copy of the original business registration from 1984, listing Helen Anderson as Secretary-Treasurer of Mitchell, Engineering as it was then called. And here, he slid another document forward, is Mrs. Anderson's business card from 1984 through 1992, clearly identifying her as co-founder and financial manager. Walter picked up the documents, frowning slightly. Richard leaned over to examine them, his face darkening. These are nearly 40 years old, Walter said dismissively. Ancient history in terms of the current value and operation of the firm. Perhaps, Martin conceded. But they established that Mrs. Anderson's role was formal and substantive, not merely supportive. And they directly contradict Mr. Anderson's characterization of his wife's contributions. Patricia, the mediator, interjected. This seems like a significant point of contention. Mr. Anderson, could you clarify your understanding of Mrs. Anderson's role in the early days of the company? Richard's jaw tightened. Yes. Nell helped with the books and some client relations in the beginning. That's not unusual for a small startup. But the engineering expertise, the technical knowledge, the professional relationships that actually built the company, those were mine, and Jerry's, after he joined as partner in 1990. I let out a small laugh. The professional relationships? Richard, do you even remember how we landed the Westridge development contract in 1988? The one that doubled our annual revenue overnight? He frowned. Of course. I met with Stephen Turner at the industry conference in Columbus. No, I said. Quietly. You didn't. I met Elaine Turner at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. We got talking about her husband's frustrations with his current engineering firm. I arranged the lunch where you met Stephen. I prepared the pitch materials you presented. I even selected the tie you wore. The blue one with subtle stripes that made you look trustworthy and innovative at the same time. Richard's face flushed. That's ridiculous. You're taking credit for business I earned through my professional expertise. Am I? Let's call Stephen. I still have his number. I'm sure he remembers who made the introduction. Walter Price held up a hand. This kind of he said, she said isn't productive. The fact remains that Mrs. Anderson hasn't been formally involved with the company for decades, regardless of any contributions in the distant past. Martin pushed another document across the table. Here is a list of 27 major clients who came to Mitchell & Thompson through Mrs. Anderson's social and community connections. Next to each name is the approximate value of contracts secured from these clients over the life of the relationship. The total exceeds $40 million. The room fell silent as Walter and Richard examined the list. Additionally, Martin continued, we have documentation of Mrs. Anderson's unpaid work organizing company events, maintaining client relationships, and essentially functioning as the firm's chief public relations officer for the past 4 decades. Work that would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if performed by paid professionals. Patricia studied both men's reactions. This seems like significant evidence of ongoing contributions to the company's success, even without a formal title. Walter leaned toward Richard, murmuring something I couldn't hear. Richard nodded, stiffly. We're prepared to acknowledge Mrs. Anderson's historical contributions to the firm's growth, Walter said carefully. In the spirit of compromise, Mr. Anderson is willing to increase his initial settlement offer by 20%. Martin didn't even look at me before responding. Unacceptable. We're not negotiating percentages of an insulting initial offer. We're establishing Mrs. Anderson's rightful claim to half of all marital assets, including the business. Half? The business? Richard exploded. That's absurd. You can't possibly think you're entitled to half of what I've built over 40 years. What we've built, I corrected. And yes, that's exactly what I think. You couldn't run Mitchell & Thompson for a day. You don't know the first thing about structural engineering. I don't need to. Just as you don't need to know the first thing about corporate finance, client relations, or strategic growth. All areas I managed while you focused on engineering. That's why we were successful, Richard. Because together we had the complete skill set necessary to build a thriving firm. Walter Price leaned forward. Mrs. Anderson, let's be realistic. Even if we accepted your characterization of your contributions, which we don't, you haven't been actively involved in day-to-day operations for years. The current value of the company reflects Mr. Anderson's ongoing leadership, not historical inputs. Actually, Mr. Price, the current value of the company reflects 40 years of cumulative effort that was only possible because I managed every other aspect of our lives. Who raised our children while Richard worked late? Who maintained our home as a showcase for entertaining clients? Who remembered every birthday, anniversary, graduation, and milestone of every significant client and employee? Who freed Richard from every domestic responsibility so he could focus entirely on his career? I turned to face Richard directly. You didn't build your career despite having a family, Richard. You built it because you had me managing your family. Richard's expression hardened. So now you're claiming credit for my professional success. Because you kept house and raised our kids. That's what wives do, Nell. That was the arrangement. The room went silent. Even Walter Price winced slightly. Thank you for making my point so succinctly, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. That was indeed the arrangement. I sacrificed my own career prospects to support yours. I invested my time, energy, and intelligence in building your business rather than pursuing my own. Now that you've decided to end our partnership, I'm entitled to my return on investment. Patricia, the mediator, cleared her throat. Perhaps we should take a short break. It seems like emotions are running high, which is understandable given the length of the marriage and the complexity of the issues at hand. We broke for 20 minutes. Martin and I stepped into a small conference room where coffee and water had been provided. You're doing extremely well, he said quietly. Richard is unsettled. He didn't expect you to have this level of documentation or to articulate your contribution so clearly. He's always underestimated me, I replied. That's been his pattern. Throughout our marriage, I was useful but not essential. A convenience, not a partner. Martin nodded. We're going to use that underestimation to our advantage. When we return, I'm going to introduce the second major component of our position. Are you ready for that? I took a deep breath. Absolutely. When we reconvened, Walter Price had noticeably shifted strategy. He began with a more conciliatory tone, acknowledging my supportive role in Richard's success and offering a revised settlement that would include a larger cash payment and continued health insurance coverage. Martin listened politely, then opened another folder. While we appreciate the modest improvement in the offer, it still fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of my client's contributions. But let's set that aside for a moment and address an entirely different matter. He slid a document across the table. This is a detailed accounting of funds transferred from Mitchell & Thompson's corporate accounts to a series of shell companies, and eventually to personal accounts controlled exclusively by Mr. Anderson, accounts that were deliberately hidden from Mrs. Anderson. Richard went completely still. Walter Price quickly glanced at the document, then at his client. "What is this?" Patricia asked. "Evidence of systematic financial misconduct," Martin said calmly. "Over the past 5 years, Mr. Anderson has diverted approximately $32 million in company funds to these hidden accounts, presumably in preparation for this divorce." Walter Price shook his head. "These are serious allegations that would require thorough investigation. We categorically deny any financial impropriety." "By all means investigate," Martin replied. "In fact, we've already provided this documentation to the State Licensing Board for Professional Engineers and to the IRS for their review. If these transfers represent legitimate business expenses, I'm sure Mr. Anderson will have no trouble explaining them." Richard's face had drained of color. "This is outrageous. You're threatening me." "No, Richard," I said quietly. "I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference." "How did you even get these records? You had no right to access company financial information." I smiled slightly. "You forget that I still have relationships with people at Mitchell & Thompson, people who've been there since the beginning, people who remember my role in building the company, people who don't approve of what you've been doing, either professionally or personally." A flash of understanding crossed Richard's face. "Linda in accounting. She always did have a soft spot for you." "Linda has integrity," I corrected. "Something you seem to have misplaced along with your wedding vows." Walter Price held up a hand to silence his client, then leaned in to whisper urgently in Richard's ear. Their hushed conversation continued for several minutes, growing increasingly tense. Finally, Walter turned back to us. "We'll need to confer more extensively about these new allegations. I suggest we adjourn for today and reconvene once we've had an opportunity to review this material." Martin nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Just be aware that our settlement position now includes the return of these diverted funds, in addition to an equitable division of the company's legitimate assets." Patricia looked between the two parties. "It seems we have some significant new information to process. Let's schedule our next session for early next week, pending the availability of all parties." As we gathered our materials to leave, Richard approached me while Walter was speaking with Patricia about scheduling. "What are you trying to prove, Nell?" he hissed, keeping his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You're going to destroy everything if you keep pushing like this." "No, Richard," I said calmly. "You destroyed everything when you decided I was disposable after 40 years. I'm simply making sure I don't go down with the wreckage." His eyes narrowed. "You won't win this. You think you have leverage, but you have no idea what you're up against." "Actually, I think I do. The question is, do you understand what you're up against? Because it isn't the meek, accommodating wife you've taken for granted all these years. That woman is gone." I walked away, joining Martin at the elevator. We didn't speak until we were in the lobby, safely out of earshot of anyone from the meeting. "You were magnificent," Martin said. "Absolutely steady. Richard is rattled. You can see it in his body language." The financial documents hit home. I observed. He didn't think I'd ever find out about those accounts. Most clients in your position wouldn't have. Your preparation has been exceptional. We stepped outside where Dot was waiting in her car. She rolled down the window. Well, how did our boy Richard take the news that his cushy little plan is going up in flames? I smiled, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Not well, but we're just getting started. That evening, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. Nell, it's Jerry. Jerry Thompson. Richard's business partner. I hadn't expected to hear from him directly. Hello, Jerry. What can I do for you? Look, I need to meet with you. In private. Without lawyers or Richard. I hesitated. I don't think that's appropriate. At this stage, Jerry. We're in the middle of legal proceedings. Please, he said, his voice uncharacteristically urgent. This isn't about taking sides. It's about protecting the company you helped build too. Just one conversation. Then if you want to bring in Martin Hayes, that's your right. I considered his request. Jerry had never been particularly warm toward me, but he'd always been fair. And unlike Richard, he'd occasionally acknowledged my contributions to the firm's success. All right, I said finally. One conversation, but in a public place. Thank you. The relief in his voice was palpable. The Riverside Cafe? Tomorrow at 10? I'll be there. I called Martin immediately afterward to inform him of the meeting. He was concerned, but understood my reasoning. Just be careful, he warned. Jerry's first loyalty will always be to the firm, which means to Richard by extension. Don't agree to anything without consulting me first. I won't. I just want to hear what he has to say. The Riverside Cafe was busy with mid-morning customers when I arrived. Jerry was already there, seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He stood when he saw me, gesturing awkwardly to the chair across from him. Nell, thank you for coming. I sat, noting how tired he looked, the dark circles under his eyes, the slump in his normally perfect posture. What's this about, Jerry? He pushed one of the coffee cups toward me. You take it with just cream, right? I remembered from all those early morning meetings. The fact that he remembered such a detail after all these years surprised me. Yes. Thank you. Jerry took a deep breath. I'm going to be direct. Those financial transfers Martin Hayes presented yesterday, they weren't Richard's idea. They were mine. I set my cup down carefully. You're admitting to financial misconduct? Not misconduct. Protection. He leaned forward. 3 years ago, Richard started taking risks with the firm that made me uncomfortable. Pursuing projects we weren't qualified for, promising clients timelines we couldn't meet, cutting corners on safety protocols. That doesn't sound like Richard, I said, frowning. Whatever his faults, he's always been meticulous about his engineering standards. Jerry nodded. He was, until Vanessa. Something cold settled in my stomach. What does she have to do with this? She convinced him he was playing too small. That with his talent and reputation, he should be competing for bigger projects, expanding into new regions. She'd show him articles about younger, less experienced firms landing massive contracts, imply that he was letting competitors overtake him. And he listened to her? Risked the reputation he spent decades building because a 34-year-old with no engineering background thought he should be more aggressive? Jerry looked away. You know how Richard is about his ego, the idea that younger firms might outshine him. It got under his skin. He started pushing for expansion, for taking on projects beyond our expertise. I pushed back. We argued. The first serious disagreements in our partnership. So where do the hidden accounts come in? I started quietly moving some of our reserves, protecting them in case his gambles didn't pay off. The intention was always to bring those funds back once Richard came to his senses. But then he began spending more and more time with Vanessa, and I realized this wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment. I studied Jerry's face, looking for signs of deception. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Richard is planning to squeeze you out completely." After yesterday's meeting, he called an emergency session with the board. A board that consists of himself, me, and 2 of his golfing buddies who've never questioned a single decision he's made. They voted to issue a special dividend to current shareholders, effectively draining the company's liquid assets before you can get access to them. My heart sank. Is that legal? Technically, yes. Ethically, not even close. That's why I abstained from the vote. And that's why I'm here. Jerry reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. This contains detailed records of every questionable decision Richard has made in the past 3 years, including projects where safety standards were compromised to meet Vanessa's ambitious timelines. It also includes emails where I explicitly warned him about potential liability issues. I stared at the small device. "Why would you give me this? You'd be implicating yourself." "Because I've spent 30 years building Mitchell & Thompson alongside you and Richard. I won't watch him destroy it because he's having a midlife crisis." Jerry pushed the flash drive toward me. "I'm not taking your side against Richard. I'm taking the company's side against Richard's worst impulses." I didn't touch the drive. "How do I know this isn't a setup? Something Richard put you up to?" Jerry actually laughed. "Richard barely speaks to me these days unless it's to override my concerns about a project. He's convinced I'm just being cautious because I'm older, that I don't have the vision or courage to take the firm to the next level, whatever that means in Vanessa's business school jargon. So what do you want from me in exchange for this information?" "When the dust settles, and it will one way or another, I want assurances that the company's core values won't be compromised. The safety standards, the attention to detail, the reputation for integrity that you and Richard and I built together. That's all." I finally picked up the flash drive, turning it over in my fingers. "I'll need to discuss this with my attorney." "Of course," Jerry said, standing. I don't wait too long. Things are moving quickly with this special dividend." After he left, I sat at the table for a long time, the flash drive heavy in my hand. This potential alliance with Jerry complicated things significantly, but it also opened up new strategic possibilities. I called Martin and briefed him on the conversation. He was skeptical but intrigued. "If what Jerry says is true, we need to act immediately to prevent the asset stripping through this special dividend," he said. "I'll file for an emergency injunction this afternoon. In the meantime, I'd like our technical consultant to review whatever's on that flash drive." By that evening, Martin had secured a temporary restraining order preventing any extraordinary financial transactions by Mitchell & Thompson until our next court date. The technical consultant confirmed that the flash drive contained exactly what Jerry had described: extensive documentation of increasingly risky business practices, overruled safety concerns, and financial maneuvering. Richard's response was swift and furious. At 9 p.m., he called my cell phone from a number I didn't recognize. I'd blocked his regular number. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded without preamble. "You have no right to interfere with legitimate business decisions." Draining company assets to avoid a fair settlement isn't a legitimate business decision, Richard. It's financial misconduct. That dividend was planned months ago. It has nothing to do with our divorce. "Save it for the judge," I said, calmly. "We have documentation proving otherwise." There was a pause. "Jerry," he said finally, "that snake went to you, didn't he? You seem to be surrounded by people you no longer trust, Richard. Perhaps you should ask yourself why that is. You've turned him against me, just like you've turned the children against me." I nearly laughed. "The children? You mean the adult son and daughter you've barely spoken to since this all began?" "I haven't needed to turn anyone against you, Richard. You're doing an excellent job of that all by yourself." "This isn't going to end well for you, Nell. You're in over your head. Actually, I think for the first time in decades, I'm finally at the right depth. Good night, Richard. I hung up, feeling strangely calm. Richard had always viewed anger as his exclusive right. He was allowed to be angry, to make demands, to take offense. I was expected to be reasonable, accommodating, understanding. That dynamic, like so many others in our relationship, had fundamentally shifted. The next morning, I received a text from Jennifer. Dad just called me ranting about how you're trying to destroy his company. What's going on? I called her immediately, not wanting this to play out over text. When she answered, I could hear the confusion in her voice. Mom? What's happening? Dad sounds completely unhinged. I explained the situation as succinctly as possible. The hidden accounts, the planned special dividend, Jerry's evidence of compromised safety standards. There was a long silence when I finished. I knew Dad could be self-centered, Jennifer said finally. But this is another level. Compromising safety standards? That's not the engineer who lectured us about structural integrity at dinner until our eyes glazed over. People change, I said, echoing Richard's words from our confrontation. Or perhaps they reveal who they truly are when tested. Are you okay? This sounds incredibly stressful. I'm better than I've been in years, actually. There's something clarifying about finally seeing the truth of your situation. I wish you'd left him years ago, Jennifer said quietly. You deserved better than the way he treated you. I wasn't ready then. I am now. After we hung up, I had a similar conversation with Daniel, who was equally shocked by Richard's behavior. Both children promised their support, whatever form the conflict took going forward. That solidarity was tested the very next day when I received an email from Walter Price with Richard copied. The subject line read, "Settlement Revision," but the content was nothing short of a declaration of war. The email outlined a new position. Richard was now claiming that I had engaged in interference with business operations and corporate espionage by obtaining confidential company documents. He was threatening to file criminal charges unless I agreed to an immediate settlement that amounted to less than 20% of our marital assets and required me to sign a non-disclosure agreement about both the marriage and the company. I forwarded the email to Martin, who called me within minutes. "This is desperate flailing," he said. "He's panicking because we've blocked his attempt to drain the company assets. Criminal charges would go nowhere. You had every right to access those documents as the wife of the company's principal and as someone with historical involvement in the business. So we don't respond? Oh, we respond, but not with fear or concession. We escalate." 2 hours later, Martin sent a blistering reply to Walter Price, with Richard and the entire board of Mitchell and Thompson copied. The email detailed every instance of financial misconduct we had documented, along with a list of safety violations that would be of great interest to state regulators and current clients. It concluded with our revised settlement demand: 50% of all marital assets including the company, full financial disclosure under penalty of perjury, and Richard's immediate resignation from active management of Mitchell and Thompson. You're asking him to step down from his own company? I asked Martin when he called to tell me the email had been sent. "It's a negotiating position," Martin explained. "We won't get everything we're asking for. But by setting the bar this high, we make lesser concessions seem reasonable by comparison." The impact was immediate. By that evening, Walter Price had requested an emergency mediation session for the following day. His email was terse, professional, and notably lacking Richard's name in the recipient list. When we arrived at Greenfield and Associates the next morning, the atmosphere was markedly different. Walter Price greeted us with strained courtesy. Patricia, the mediator, seemed bewildered by the rapid escalation of hostilities. But the most noticeable change was Richard himself. Gone was the confident, dismissive man who had patronized me in our first session. In his place sat someone I barely recognized, pale, disheveled, with dark circles under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands as he shuffled papers. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Walter Price began with a carefully worded statement. After reviewing the additional documentation provided by Mrs. Anderson's counsel, my client is prepared to consider a more comprehensive settlement framework that better reflects the complexity of the parties' financial entanglements. Martin nodded. We're glad to hear that. Does this framework include full financial disclosure of all accounts, domestic and foreign? Walter hesitated. We're prepared to provide complete disclosure of all relevant accounts. All accounts, Martin corrected, not just those Mr. Anderson deems relevant. Walter glanced at Richard, who nodded almost imperceptibly. All accounts, Walter confirmed. For the next 3 hours, we negotiated intensely over every aspect of the settlement. Richard remained largely silent, speaking only when directly addressed by Walter or Patricia. I remembered countless business dinners where he had dominated the conversation, holding forth on engineering principles or company strategy, while I smiled and nodded supportively. The role reversal was striking. By mid-afternoon, we had reached a tentative agreement. I would receive 40% of all marital assets, including a 30% ownership stake in Mitchell & Thompson. Richard would remain as CEO, but would be required to consult with a newly expanded board, including 2 independent directors, on all major company decisions. All the diverted funds would be returned to company accounts, and a forensic accountant would verify complete financial disclosure. As Patricia summarized the terms for final confirmation, Richard finally looked at me directly. Are you satisfied now? He asked quietly. Now that you've taken nearly half of everything I've built? I met his gaze steadily. I didn't take anything, Richard. I earned my share through 40 years of partnership. A partnership you chose to end. The only difference is that now, my contributions will be formally recognized and compensated. You could have had a comfortable life without all this, he said, gesturing to the settlement documents. I would have provided for you. I never wanted to be provided for, I replied. I wanted to be valued. When the meeting concluded, Walter Price and Richard left immediately. Martin and I remained behind to review the draft agreement one more time before signing. You've achieved an exceptional outcome, Martin said as we gathered our things. Many spouses in your position would have settled for far less, especially against someone with Richard's resources and business acumen. Richard's mistake was thinking I didn't understand his resources or his business, I said. He forgot who balanced the checkbook for 40 years. Outside, Dot was waiting in her car as promised. She rolled down the window as we approached. Well, is it done? Are you rich? I laughed, my first genuine laugh in weeks. Not just rich, recognized. As Martin departed for his office to finalize the paperwork, I slid into Dot's passenger seat and let out a long, cleansing breath. What now? Dot asked, pulling away from the curb. Now I start the second half of my life, I said. On my own terms. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, I attended my first board meeting at Mitchell & Thompson as an official shareholder. The conference room felt different from this side of the table. For decades I had organized these meetings, ordered the catering, prepared the materials, always in service to Richard's vision, always as an extension of his professional needs. Now I was here as myself, with my own voice, my own vote, my own perspective. The boardroom had been renovated since my last visit, sleek modern furniture replacing the heavy traditional pieces Richard had always preferred. Fresh orchids graced the center of the table instead of the predictable peace lilies. Small changes that suggested Vanessa's influence. I wondered idly if she'd selected the art on the walls as well. Abstract canvases in cool blues and grays, replacing the architectural photographs Richard had always favored. Jerry arrived first, greeting me with a warmth that still surprised me. Our alliance during the divorce proceedings had evolved into something resembling actual friendship. He pulled out the chair beside mine. "How are you feeling?" he asked, quietly. "First meeting as official board member. Nervous?" I smiled. "Not nervous, just processing the irony. I've attended hundreds of meetings in this building, but never as someone whose opinion actually mattered on record." "Your opinion always mattered," Jerry said. "Richard just wasn't always smart enough to acknowledge it." The other board members filtered in. The two independent directors we'd appointed as part of the settlement, Grace Winters, a retired engineering professor with a reputation for uncompromising integrity, and Marcus Lee, a financial expert who specialized in ethical corporate governance. Both had been selected from a list I'd prepared, though Richard had been given veto power. It spoke volumes that he'd accepted them without protest, a sign of just how thoroughly our confrontation had humbled him. Richard arrived last, Vanessa at his side. He'd aged visibly in the month since our divorce had been finalized. Deeper, lines around his mouth, more silver threading through his hair. His expression tightened when he saw me, but he managed a curt nod before taking his seat at the head of the table. Vanessa's reaction was more complex. A flicker of surprise followed, by a calculated smile. She'd clearly not expected me to attend in person, perhaps thinking I'd exercise my board rights through a proxy. She wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than what most people in the room earned in a week. Her dark hair, swept into an elegant chignon. She was beautiful, poised, and unmistakably out of her depth in a room full of engineering and financial experts. "Good morning, everyone," Richard began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent decades being the final word on every decision. "Let's begin with the quarterly financials." The meeting progressed with a formality that felt almost theatrical. Richard presented each agenda item with careful neutrality, avoiding any phrasing that might invite disagreement. When questions arose, he answered with uncharacteristic brevity. No one mentioned our divorce, or the settlement, or the circumstances that had brought us to this reconfigured table. It wasn't necessary. The entire restructuring of the board was testament to those events. I spoke only when I had meaningful input, letting my expertise in client relationships and financial management guide my contributions. Each time I did, Richard's jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly, but he never interrupted or dismissed my points, another departure from our long history. During a discussion about a potential new client, Vanessa attempted to assert herself, suggesting an aggressive timeline for project completion. "We should commit to a 12-month delivery," she said. "It would give us an edge over competitors, who are estimating 18 to 24 months. Grace Winters, the engineering professor, fixed her with a measured look. "Based on the scope documents I've reviewed, 12 months would require either additional resources we don't currently have or compromises in quality control that would be inconsistent with this firm's standards." "Which are you suggesting, Ms. Cooper?" Vanessa faltered, clearly unprepared for such direct challenge. Well, I was thinking we could optimize our processes, increase efficiency." "Efficiency isn't a magic wand," Grace replied. "It's the result of specific implementable improvements. Do you have any particular process optimizations in mind?" Richard stepped in. "I think what Vanessa is suggesting is that we could consider reorganizing our project teams to better leverage our existing resources." Jerry raised an eyebrow. "We've analyzed our team structures 3 times in the past 2 years. Each analysis concluded we're operating at near optimal efficiency already." I watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was exactly what the board restructuring had been designed to achieve, a system of checks and balances where decisions were made based on expertise and evidence, not ego or ambition. By the end of the meeting, several things had become clear. Richard was no longer the unchallenged ruler of the kingdom he'd built. Vanessa's influence had been significantly curtailed by the new governance structure. and Mitchell and Thompson was returning to the core values that had made it successful in the first place: integrity, quality, and meticulous attention to detail. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my materials unhurriedly, in no rush to leave a space I now rightfully occupied. Richard and Vanessa departed quickly, but Jerry lingered. "Dinner next week?" he asked. "Miranda's been asking when you'll come over again. She's trying out some new pasta recipe she found." Miranda was Jerry's wife of 35 years, a warm, forthright woman who had welcomed me into their home with genuine affection since my divorce. "I'd love that," I said. "Thursday? Perfect. I'll tell her you're coming." As I walked to my car in the executive parking section, another small victory from the settlement, I felt a curious sense of completion. For decades, Richard had been the sun around which my entire life orbited. Now he was just another person in my professional sphere, no more central to my daily existence than any other colleague. I drove to my apartment at Willow Creek, which I'd decided to keep even after the settlement provided ample funds for a more luxurious residence. I'd grown to love its simplicity, its river views, and most importantly, the fact that every inch of it represented choices I had made for myself. My phone rang as I was unlocking my door. Jennifer's name flashed on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, setting my briefcase on the kitchen counter. "How are things in Columbus?" "Good. Great, actually. Tom got the promotion, and Ella made the tennis team." Ella was my 12-year-old granddaughter, Jennifer's oldest. "That's wonderful news. Tell them both congratulations from Grandma." "I will." She paused. "So, how was the board meeting?" I smiled at her transparent attempt at casualness. Both Jennifer and Daniel had been intensely protective since the divorce, checking in regularly and asking pointed questions about how Richard was treating me. It was fine. Professional. Productive. I began brewing a cup of tea, phone cradled against my shoulder. "Your father kept things strictly business." "And the girlfriend? Vanessa?" "Also there, also professional, though somewhat out of her depth." Jennifer made a sound that managed to convey both satisfaction and lingering anger. "Good. I hope—" She was miserably uncomfortable the entire time. "Jennifer," I chided gently, "that's uncharitable." "Mom, she helped break up your 40-year marriage. I'm allowed to be uncharitable." I sighed, settling onto my sofa with my tea. "Your father—" And I had problems long before Vanessa appeared. She was a symptom, not the cause. Still, Jennifer wasn't ready to absolve anyone. "Anyway, that's not why I called. I wanted to tell you that we're coming to Riverside next weekend. The kids have been asking to see you, and Tom has some business there on Friday, so we thought we'd make a family trip of it." "I'd love that. We could have dinner here Saturday. I'll cook." "Actually," Jennifer said, her tone shifting to something almost hesitant, "I was thinking maybe you could show us some houses while we're there. Help us get a feel for the neighborhoods." I paused, teacup halfway to my lips. "Houses? In Riverside?" "Tom's company is opening a regional office there. They've asked if he'd consider relocating to head it up. It would be a big step up for him, and well, we've been thinking it might be nice for the kids to be closer to their grandmother." Something warm unfurled in my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope, maybe. Or simply the recognition that life still held unexpected gifts. "I'd love to help you look at houses," I said, trying to keep the emotion from my voice, "and having you all nearby would be wonderful." "We think so too. The kids are thrilled at the idea of being able to see you regularly instead of just on holidays." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony watching evening settle over the river, thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in less than a year. From the dutiful corporate wife arranging her days around her husband's convenience to an independent woman with a stake in a multi-million-dollar company, a voice in its governance, and most precious of all, the prospect of having family nearby again. The following Tuesday, I had lunch with Dot at the Lakeside Cafe, our regular weekly meeting that had become a cherished ritual. She was already seated at our favorite table when I arrived, a glass of wine at her elbow despite the early hour. "I'm celebrating," she explained before I could comment. "My design for the Westridge Community Center was approved this morning. Construction starts next month." "Dot, that's fantastic." I slid into the seat across from her. "I know how hard you worked on that proposal." Dot had reinvented herself after her own divorce 15 years earlier, returning to school for interior design and gradually building a reputation for elegant, functional spaces that emphasized natural light and sustainable materials. The community center would be her largest public project to date. "The best part?" she said, leaning forward with a conspiratorial smile. "The project manager for the construction company is Peter Williams. You remember him?" "Vaguely. Didn't we meet him at that charity auction last year? Silver hair, very tan?" "That's him. Widower, 68, still runs 5 miles every morning." She wiggled her eyebrows suggestively. "We're having dinner Friday." I laughed. "Dot, are you using a multi-million-dollar community center as a dating opportunity?" "Absolutely not," she said with mock indignation. "The community center is a professional achievement I earned through talent and hard work. The dinner with Peter is simply a fortunate coincidence." "Well, I hope it's a lovely coincidence." Dot took a sip of her wine. "Enough about my burgeoning romance. How was the board meeting? Did Richard behave himself?" I filled her in on the details as our food arrived. A Caesar salad for me, French onion soup for Dot. She listened intently, nodding at the descriptions of Richard's subdued demeanor and Vanessa's unsuccessful attempt to influence the project timeline. "It's remarkable," she said when I finished. "A year ago, you were arranging his dry cleaning and making sure he had exactly the right tie for every client meeting. Now you're helping govern the company he thought was exclusively his domain." "Life contains some exquisite ironies," I agreed. "Speaking of ironies, have you heard the latest about Richard and Vanessa's house hunt?" I raised an eyebrow. "No. Should I care?" "Probably not, but it's too delicious not to share. They've been trying to buy in Cedar Heights, you know, that exclusive gated community Richard always said was overpriced for what you get." "I remember. What about it?" "Well, apparently they've been rejected by the Homeowners Association. Twice." I set down my fork. "Rejected? On what grounds?" Dot's eyes sparkled with mischief. "The official reason was some technicality about their financing. But Amanda Lewis sits on that board. You remember her. We served on the hospital fundraising committee with her for years. And she told me the real issue is that several board members are clients of Mitchell and Thompson who weren't happy with how Richard handled some recent projects. They're concerned about his commitment to quality." "That's—" I hesitated, searching for the appropriate response. Part of me, a small, petty part I wasn't particularly proud of, felt a flash of satisfaction. But the larger part recognized the irony that Richard's professional shortcuts, the very behavior I'd fought against, were now affecting his personal life in ways he hadn't anticipated. "It's karma," Dot supplied helpfully. "The universe balancing its books?" I smiled despite myself. "I suppose it is." "Are you going to the Mitchell and Thompson anniversary gala next month?" Dot asked, changing the subject. The gala, a lavish annual event celebrating the firm's founding, had always been my responsibility to organize. For 30 years, I'd selected venues, approved menus, designed centerpieces, and coordinated seating charts to ensure optimal client relationship management. This would be the first year I'd attend as a guest, rather than as the designer and orchestrator of the entire experience. "I haven't decided," I admitted. "Part of me thinks I should go, to reinforce my position as a board member and shareholder. But another part wonders if it would just be awkward for everyone." "Go," Dot said firmly. "Wear something spectacular. Remind everyone that you're not just Richard's ex-wife. You're a power in your own right." I'll think about it, I promised. Though in truth, the idea of attending an event where I'd be the subject of whispers and speculation held little appeal. The following weekend, Jennifer and her family arrived for their visit. Having my daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren fill my apartment with noise and energy was a joy I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Ella, at 12, was serious and inquisitive, peppering me with questions about the river and the wildlife she could see from my balcony. 9-year-old Max was all motion and enthusiasm, eager to show me his latest video game achievements and the soccer trophies he'd brought to display. On Saturday, we toured neighborhoods, looking at houses that might suit their family. It was strange being on this side of a real estate search, offering opinions and suggestions rather than deferring to Richard's preferences as I had when we'd been house hunting. "What about schools in this area?" Jennifer asked as we drove through a tree-lined neighborhood of handsome colonial-style homes, not unlike the one I'd shared with Richard. "Excellent," I replied. "Riverside Elementary is one of the best in the state, and the middle and high schools have strong academic programs plus good sports and arts offerings." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "And it's what, 15 minutes from your place?" 10 in good traffic. Close enough for impromptu visits, but not so close we'd be in each other's pockets. She smiled. "Perfect." As they prepared to leave on Sunday afternoon, Jennifer pulled me aside. "Mom, I just want to say, I'm proud of you. For standing up for yourself, for claiming what you deserved, for showing us what strength really looks like." Tears pricked at my eyes. "I'm not sure I feel very strong. Most days I'm just figuring it out as I go along." "That's what strength is," she said, hugging me tightly. "Not having all the answers, but moving forward anyway." After they left, the apartment felt emptier than usual, but in a way that held promise rather than loneliness. The possibility of having them nearby permanently filled me with a quiet joy that sustained me through the quiet evening. The following week brought an unexpected invitation, an email from Charlotte Griffin, the president of the Riverside Women's Business Alliance. I'd known Charlotte casually for years, primarily through charity events where Mitchell & Thompson was a donor. "Dear Mrs. Anderson," the email began, "I'm reaching out to invite you to be our keynote speaker at next month's annual leadership luncheon. Our theme this year is reinvention and resilience, and your recent transition from supporting role to corporate leadership exemplifies both qualities. We would be honored to have you share your journey with our members." I stared at the screen, momentarily speechless. Me? A keynote speaker? The idea was simultaneously flattering and terrifying. Throughout my marriage, public speaking had been Richard's domain. I had been the one who prepared his notes, reviewed his slides, made sure his water glass was full before he took the podium, never the one whose voice was deemed worth hearing. I called Dot for advice. "You absolutely have to do it," she said without hesitation. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity you should be embracing in this new chapter of your life." "What would I even say?" I asked. "I'm hardly a business leader. I just happen to own shares in a company I helped build." "Are you serious?" Dot's tone made it clear she thought I was being intentionally obtuse. "Nell, you managed the finances of a startup engineering firm that grew into a regional powerhouse. You cultivated client relationships that brought in millions in contracts. You balanced corporate and family demands with grace for 4 decades. And when your husband betrayed you, you fought back with intelligence and strategy instead of emotion. You have plenty to say that these women would benefit from hearing." Put that way, I supposed I did have experiences worth sharing. "All right," I said. "I'll do it." The next few weeks flew by in a flurry of preparation, drafting and refining my speech, selecting an appropriate outfit, practicing my delivery in front of the mirror until the words flowed naturally. I chose to focus my remarks not on Richard's betrayal or our divorce, but on the broader themes of recognizing one's own value and having the courage to claim it. The day of the luncheon arrived clear and bright. A perfect October afternoon with just enough crispness in the air to energize without chilling. The event was being held at the Riverside Grand Hotel, in the same ballroom where Richard and I had attended countless charity galas and business functions over the years. But this time, I entered alone, head high, purpose clear. Charlotte met me in the lobby, elegant in a crimson suit that complemented her silver hair. "Helen, thank you so much for agreeing to speak today. We have a full house, over 300 members and guests. 300 people." I took a deep breath, calming the flutter of nerves in my stomach. I'm honored to have been asked. She led me through the pre-luncheon reception, introducing me to board members and sponsors. Many faces were familiar from various social and charitable circles, though the greetings I received now carried a different weight. Respect, rather than the polite acknowledgement usually accorded to an executive's wife. "Mrs. Anderson, I was so pleased when I saw you were speaking today." A middle-aged woman approached, extending her hand. "Karen Davis. We met at the Hospital Foundation dinner last year. I was seated at your table." I smiled, placing her. "Of course, Mrs. Davis. Your husband heads Davis Construction, if I recall correctly." "That's right. Though I'm now the CEO. Michael retired last spring." "Congratulations on the promotion." She leaned in slightly. "I hope you don't mind my saying this, but your divorce settlement was the talk of the business community. The way you negotiated for fair recognition of your contributions. It was inspiring, especially for those of us who've worked alongside our husbands without formal titles." Before I could respond, Charlotte signaled that it was time to move to the ballroom for lunch. I was seated at the head table, between Charlotte and the Alliance's treasurer, a sharp-eyed banker named Virginia Oakes. "I understand you've joined the board at Mitchell & Thompson," Virginia said as salads were served. "How are you finding corporate governance?" "Educational," I replied honestly. "I've observed board dynamics for years, but participating as a voting member is quite different." "I imagine your perspective as someone who's seen the company from multiple angles is invaluable." "It should be," I said, "though I'm not sure everyone on the board would agree." Virginia smiled knowingly. "They will in time, especially when your insights prove correct." After lunch, Charlotte introduced me with a flattering summary of my career and recent transition to corporate leadership, as she delicately phrased it. As I took the podium, looking out over the sea of attentive faces, I felt a momentary panic. Then I remembered Jennifer's words. Strength isn't having all the answers, but moving forward anyway. "Thank you, Charlotte, for that generous introduction," I began. "And thank you to the Riverside Women's Business Alliance for inviting me to share some thoughts on reinvention and resilience. These are qualities I've come to know intimately in recent months, though I wouldn't have chosen the circumstances that brought them into focus." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. For 40 years, I was known primarily as Richard Anderson's wife. It was an identity I embraced wholeheartedly, pouring my education, talents, and energy into supporting his vision for Mitchell & Thompson Engineering. I managed our home, raised our children, cultivated social connections that brought in valuable clients, and in the early days, even handled the company books, all without a title, salary, or formal recognition. I paused, looking out at the women watching me, some nodding in recognition, others leaning forward in interest. I don't share this as a complaint. It was the partnership we agreed to, explicitly or implicitly. But when that partnership dissolved, I was faced with a critical question. Who am I beyond the roles I've played in service to others? What is my value, independent of my connection to my husband and his company? For the next 20 minutes, I spoke about the journey of self-reclamation, the painful recognition of how I'd allowed myself to be diminished, the courage it took to demand fair acknowledgement of my contributions, and the unexpected joy of rediscovering parts of myself that had been set aside for decades. The greatest revelation, I concluded, wasn't learning that I could stand on my own. It was realizing that I had been standing all along. I just hadn't recognized my own strength, because I'd been taught to attribute it to someone else. My resilience wasn't born in the crucible of divorce. It was built through 40 years of solving problems, navigating challenges, and creating value that others benefited from. The only thing that changed was my willingness to claim that strength as my own. The applause that followed was genuinely enthusiastic. As I returned to my seat, Charlotte squeezed my hand. "Perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." After the luncheon, a line of women formed to speak with me, some offering congratulations on the speech, others sharing their own stories of undervalued contributions and difficult reckonings. I listened with genuine interest, recognizing elements of my own experience in each of their narratives. One conversation particularly struck me, with a young woman barely older than Vanessa, who approached somewhat hesitantly. "Mrs. Anderson, I just wanted to say thank you. I started a marketing firm with my husband 3 years ago. On paper, we're equal partners, but lately, I've felt my contributions being minimized. Your speech helped me see that I need to address this now, not 40 years from now. The best partnerships are those where both parties are fully valued," I told her. "If that's not happening, it's worth the discomfort of addressing it directly." She nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what I needed to hear. By the time I left the hotel, the afternoon was fading into evening. I felt simultaneously energized and exhausted. The emotional expenditure of sharing my story publicly had taken more from me than I'd anticipated. But there was also satisfaction in knowing that my experience might help others avoid the mistakes I'd made. As I drove home along the river, my phone rang through the car's speaker system. Daniel's name appeared on the dashboard display. "Hello, sweetheart," I answered. "How are things in Cincinnati?" "Good, Mom. Really good, actually. I just wanted to call and check in. Jennifer told me about their visit and the possible move to Riverside. That would be wonderful for all of you." "It would," I agreed. "Having the grandchildren nearby would be a joy." "It's got me thinking," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "About distance and family and priorities. Rebecca and I have been talking." Rebecca was Daniel's wife of 10 years, a pediatrician with a thriving practice in Cincinnati. "Talking about what?" I prompted when he didn't continue. "About whether it might make sense for us to consider Riverside too. There's an excellent children's hospital that's recruiting specialists, and my practice could be transferred relatively easily. Nothing definite yet, but we're exploring the possibility." My heart swelled with emotion. "Daniel, that would be... I don't even have words." He laughed softly. "Don't get too excited yet. It's just preliminary discussions. But after everything that happened with you and Dad, it's made us realize how important family connections are, how easily they can be lost if not nurtured." "I understand completely," I said. "And whatever you decide, I'm just grateful you're considering it." After we hung up, I continued my drive, a sense of peaceful contentment washing over me. The road ahead, both literally and figuratively, stretched out clear and inviting, filled with possibilities I couldn't have imagined a year ago. The old life I'd built around Richard's needs and ambitions had crumbled, but from its ruins, something new and authentically mine was emerging. A life shaped by my own choices, values, and desires. A life where I was the center of my own story, not a supporting character in someone else's. The irony wasn't lost on me. By leaving with everything Richard valued, my stake in his company, my place on his board, my rightful share of our assets, I'd finally discovered what I truly valued. And it had nothing to do with money or status or revenge. What I valued was authenticity, self-respect, the freedom to define myself rather than being defined by my relationship to a man who had never truly seen me. Richard had left me for his secretary. But I had left with something far more precious than material assets. I had left with myself, whole and unbowed, ready at last to live on my own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right. On your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.